This podcast is general in nature and hasn't taken your circumstances into account. It's important you consider your personal circumstances and speak to a financial advisor before deciding what's right for you. Any general tax information provided is provided as a guide only. Now, here's Shane and Deanna.
Hi everyone. Hi Shane.
Hi Deanna.
So we've seen some geopolitical risks emerge in the past few weeks, and most importantly was, I guess, the driver of that was the outcomes of the European parliamentary elections, which I don't remember ever getting so much media attention as they have this time around. They happen every 5 years, and there's all these members of parliament that are elected. Can you tell us about why these parliamentary elections are important? It's not actually a vote on the country's leaders. What is it actually a vote on?
Most people wouldn't even know what it is. They know more about Eurovision than the EU Parliament.
It's a bit more entertaining.
It certainly is more entertaining. That's where ABBA came from. Lots of people over the years have gone to Eurovision. I think Engelbert Humperdinck was he a UK entrant to Europe?
I have no idea. Even though I watch Eurovision every year.
I have this thing where every so often I get obsessed with middle-of-the-road music, because middle of the road was very popular in the 70s. So it's Andy Williams and Frank Sinatra, and sometimes it gets too croony. Mm-hmm. And Engelbert was a little bit too croony for me, whereas Andy Williams I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, you don't hear of middle of the road anymore. You used to have this category called MOR. That was the category. But anyway, enough of Eurovision.
And the Eurovision movie on Netflix was very good too, with Will Ferrell.
It was hilarious. I love Will. In fact, I was thinking the other night I need to watch a Will Ferrell film. Maybe I'll watch The Campaign. It was a good...
Wedding Crashers.
Yeah, that was a good one too. And the other one, of course, was Anchorman. The first Anchorman was hilarious, particularly the bit where he plays the flute. Anyway, how did we get onto this stuff? Eurovision and EU elections. The significance was that they are often seen as a bit of a protest vote. So people at the moment are not very happy, a bit like in Australia, because of the cost of living pressures, rise in interest rates. And so they use it as a protest vote. And they go... turnout is usually only about 50%. This time it's only around 51%, unlike in Australia where democracy is compulsory. In Europe it's voluntary, so you don't have to vote. So only the motivated people show up, and this time they got all motivated, and some of them voted for what you'd call the far right. Mm-hmm. I've had debates with people about what is the far right, but anyway, people like the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany and Le Pen's National Rally.
And what do these far right groups stand for?
Well, generally speaking, they're known for, I guess, a nativist or nationalistic view, and so down on immigration. But the reason markets get concerned about them, and this is why there was the reaction to this, was because they have views which are not as friendly towards Europe. That they often promote things like protectionism, more government spending, less market-friendly economic policies. And of course, what happened in this election was that there is a bit of a swing towards the far-right parties. If you look at the makeup of the new European Union Parliament, there'll be more far-right seats in there than before. Now, of course, you don't want to exaggerate this, because the number of far-right seats has really just gone from about 20% of the total to about 22%, depending on how you cut it, how you add it up. And the centrists, that's the centre-right or the centre-left, still dominate things. I think they've gone from about 67, 68 down to 63% of the seats. So it's still dominated by the centre. So you don't want to get too excited here. But the real impact was, of course, in France, where Marine Le Pen's national rally, which used to be further to the right than it is these days, it's become a bit more moderate to try and get more votes. It got more than 30% of the votes, compared to Emmanuel Macron. He's the president. His party, called Renaissance, it only got about 15%. So he immediately thought, well, this is potential rejection of his presidency and his policies. So he called an election for the French Parliament. Mm-hmm. And of course, this has immediately set off uncertainty. That election is not due until 2027. It's 3 years ahead of schedule, and it runs the risk that the National Rally may be able to form government in France, and therefore he'd be at loggerheads as president. He still controls a lot of things like foreign policy, and he does have some veto over what the parliament does, but not a complete one. And therefore there could be tensions between what a national rally government might want to do, whether it's in its own right or in alliance with other parties, and whether that would conflict with EU rules around fiscal stimulus and so on, and whether in particular they might want to wind back his market-friendly policies, such as the most well-known one is in France. They had a retirement age, which I think was 60. In Australia, it's 66, 67 or something. He was trying to raise the retirement age, which he did. And of course, National Rally is saying we're going to wind that back again. And of course, those sorts of things lead to questionable fiscal dynamics in France, which already has a high level of public debt. That then caused a fall in the French share market, fell about 6%. Eurozone shares fell about 4%. This was in the week after the election. And of course, a sharp rise in bond yields on French government bonds, leading to a concern that we're going back to the Eurozone crisis.
So are we going to see a Frexit?
Look, I don't think we will. That's the concern there, that maybe things will get so bad under a National Rally government that they could have a Frexit, which is short for French exit from the euro. Now, of course, those who have long memories will remember all the issues about a Grexit. This all started way back in 2009 with concerns about Greece. It then rolled on to a Spexit, a Spanish exit potentially, an Itexit, Italian exit. And then we did have a Brexit, but of course that was just a sideshow because Britain was never in the Eurozone. So it was always academic, and the Brits were always a bit different to the Europeans. You can see that when you look at surveys. Europeans tend to say, I feel a bit more European. I'm not just French, I'm not just Dutch, I'm not just German, I'm also a bit European. The British never related to that well.
Yeah.
They're predominantly British. And so it was always a bit different. But that is certainly the fear that markets have, that there'll be some sort of situation which leads to France, and then it'll flow on maybe again to Italy and Spain, leaving the euro, and then investors in their bonds don't get paid back in euros, they get paid back in devalued francs, lira, forgetting what the currencies used to be for these countries, if they have to leave the euro. So that's what the concern has been, that things would start to unravel again in Europe as a result of this election. Now, there's a few reasons why we shouldn't get too paranoid about all of this. Firstly, the commitment to the euro across Europe is very high. Something like 69% of Europeans say that the euro is good for their country.
And what about in France?
In France, it's 67%, so still pretty high. And that is why Le Pen's National Rally has dropped their policy platform, which was to leave the euro. They're not great on Europe, but they've dropped this plan to leave the euro because they realise that they can never attain government if they're opposing the euro, because the majority of French people like the euro. Secondly, as markets sell off, it puts pressure on. And we saw that through the Eurozone crisis last decade. Each time bond yields go up, it makes it harder for the government to borrow money. And therefore, even if there was a change of government, like we saw in Greece, for example, there was Syriza, I think it was called, I've got the precise pronunciation. They had to back down from their more radical policies, ultimately because markets jacked up.
Yeah.
Much like we saw in the UK a year or so ago when Boris Johnson stepped down. So all these sorts of things act as a little bit of a break. And of course, we don't know the outcome of the French elections. It's going to occur over in the next week or so in 2 rounds. That also adds to a bit of uncertainty. But there is a good chance that Le Pen won't. Its polls are pretty unclear. But it's not clear that Le Pen will be able to form government. And a likely scenario could well be just a continuation of a centrist government that works with Macron.
It just seems a bit disjointed in terms of how the parliament would work, because Macron would still be president. I think it'll be difficult for them to actually pass any policies over the next 3 years if all these parties have, I don't know if they're going to have a majority. So we could see really nothing happening over the next few years in France in terms of policy.
That's certainly a concern. Like the president does have a lot of control, but on domestic policies, the parliament can get things through if they have a clear majority. And that's where all the uncertainty is. I guess Macron perhaps might be hoping that even if National Rally does form government, they stuff things up so badly and people by 2027, which is when the next round of elections would be due, including for the president, that they all go back to the centre and whoever replaces him in the Renaissance Party wins over Le Pen. So he could be gambling along those lines. So a lot of uncertainty around all of this, but just bear in mind there that there is a lot of institutional support across Europe to stay, for countries to stay in the euro. It's never that simple. And even when you do have these blow-ups every so often, there tends to be forces, often driven by market forces, which bring everything back into line again. So I wouldn't want to get too pessimistic about this, but it does raise a broader issue here and highlight an issue that we've seen since the GFC, that electorates are getting more twitchy, people are less supportive of free market policies, and that's led to, I guess, more support for tariffs. And of course, we have seen some more announcements on that front recently, and of course, you've been having a look at that.
Well, I think that the pandemic and Trump's initial trade policies in 2018 and the general trend that we've seen in the past few years, where we've seen a move towards deglobalization, so the share of export and import growth around the world looks to have peaked as countries have either become more protectionist or they've kind of banded together in these small like-minded blocks. I think this general trend has set us up for a more protectionist world. And Trump is campaigning, if he wins the presidency, to impose a 10% across-the-board tariff on all US imports and a 60% tariff on Chinese imports. And that would be much higher than anything that he imposed in 2018 or even anything that Biden has imposed since then, because Biden has actually remained pretty hawkish on China as well. And he's lifted tariffs on some specific Chinese imports, things like electric vehicles, or that they don't start for another few years, or even other types of high manufactured goods. So I guess it's a strategic response to the rise of China, especially as they move into more of that highly manufactured exporting sector, like around batteries, semiconductor chips, and electric vehicles. The US is responding to that threat, but then also just, I guess, this broader move towards a protectionist world. So if we saw those tariffs imposed by Trump, then that would take the US tariff rate to about 17%, which is the highest that it would have been since about the 1930s. And that would have a big negative impact on the US economy, because it would increase consumer prices and it would probably be a negative for growth. I guess some people would say, well, it would increase US jobs, US manufacturing and investment. But I think at least initially it would be a big negative for the US economy. And I think share markets would take it as a big negative risk, because we know in 2018 that share markets didn't like the trade war risk. And also other countries are likely to retaliate as well. If he imposes all these tariffs on the global economy, on all US imports, then it's very likely that Europe and China would retaliate, because they have in the past.
Yeah, the one thing, I mean, I sort of grew up in a world where tariffs were very high on imports in Australia. And the one thing that I always think of tariffs is that they may be popular because people think, oh, well, it would protect local industry. But the people who end up paying for it are consumers. And I had an example of that recently. I was up at a market I had a little holiday in southeast Queensland and went to this local markets in Yamundi, and there was a guy there selling crystals. And I've always been into crystals, but he told me about this thing called shingrite. And I said, what do I want shingrite for? And he says, well, given these gadgets, mobile phones, there's electromagnetic waves all over the place. And it may partly explain why, for example, you're seeing more brain tumours in kids, the younger age than we used to see. And shingrite will protect you. If you have a little bit of shingrite next to your bed at night, it'll protect you from the electromagnetic waves that come from things like your Wi-Fi. And of course, they're not just in the air with the 3G and the 4G and the 5G, but they're also with Wi-Fi. And then I said, well, how much does this stuff cost? And he tells me he has to pay 35% tariff on it because it comes from a little town in Russia where shingrite is produced. And so it's now gone up massively in price. And
because
so,
the sanctions.
Because of the sanctions. And so on the one hand, those sanctions were put in place because of Russia's, the war with Ukraine. And therefore we're trying to put an economic burden on Russia, but it also has an impact on others around the world who want the products, because you can't get shingrite anywhere else as far as I can see. So in the end, I thought, well, this is a bit too expensive. I better do some more research to work out whether it's worth buying my shingrite to protect myself from the electromagnetic waves that engulf me as I sleep at night.
I kind of had a similar experience because I like buying a lot of Russian food from the deli, and the deli owner was telling me that they now get the Russian products via Germany, so they pay less of, I guess, a tariff if it comes via Germany. So I haven't. There's definitely been an increase in prices, but I wouldn't say it's been like a 30% increase. So I guess what happens with these tariffs or even potentially sanctions is that companies try and find a way around it. Like now, China is even thinking with the 100% tariff on electric vehicles that the US has imposed on them, maybe they'll try and find a route via Mexico or change their production facilities somehow to try and avoid these tariffs. So at the end of the day, maybe the tariffs don't even work like they're supposed to. And I think you can see that even with the experience with Russia, since all the sanctions have been imposed, I think some companies have tried to find a way around it.
Yeah, and that was the experience in the post-war era in Australia. We had tariffs protecting our car industry. I was buying Holdens till the end, till 2017, my last Holden, but other Australians weren't. They said, okay, despite the tariffs, we're going off and buying cars from somewhere else. So as the price of cars internationally fell anyway. So I must admit I'm skeptical. I know these things are popular and people like made in Australia and all that sort of stuff, but the reality of these things is they don't work. And I think ultimately you end up paying a price for it, either in higher inflation or lower living standards than you otherwise would have had.
Well, that's it for today. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Diana. Take care.
For more info on Shane and Diana's podcasts and reports, head to the Insights Hub at amp.com.au.